back to Live and Breathe Horses, and today we are going on with this fabulous book, More Than a Horseman, which is a collection of stories about Tom Dorrance by his wife and John St. Ryan, Margaret Dorrance, of course. And today's story is rather a long one, so get comfortable or listen when you're on a drive. They're a bit more podcast and video worthy, these stories really. And today is from Rodney Flournoy or Flournoy. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I forget the correct pronunciation of your name. I do apologize. So, yeah, here we go. I think a lot about what I might write about the time and work Tom and I did with ranching, cattle and horses. Our first visit was in January of 1988, and our last visit was about 10 days or 2 weeks before he died, June 11th, 2003. We packed so much into those 15 years, and so many of those conversations have been so helpful to me that I don't really know where or how to begin writing about it all, or in part. With almost everything I do here, as diverse and varied as the jobs and work are, I think of something Tom and I discussed that pertains to that thing. Then I may not think of that particular information again for years. Just this morning, I was helping harness some of the draft horses, and I started to collar a big draft horse named Jim. I noticed his collar had some dirt stuck to the leather where it would bear against his shoulder when the horse pulled a load. I took the collar over by a window and laid one end on a sill board so I could scrape the leather clean with my pocket knife held edgeways. And as I cleaned the collar, I told a fellow about how Tom stressed the importance of cleaning those collars off while they're warm, when they've just been taken off the horse. Tom said his dad, Church Dorrance, was very particular to see to it all the teamsters cleaned their collars as soon as the collars came off the horse. Tom said, if a man didn't pick up on that real soon and stay diligent to keep the collars clean, he was almost sure to be looking for a job somewhere else. Tom said another thing that didn't work with Dad was for a fellow to not eat a good breakfast. It was important enough that a person better be sure he didn't eat too big of a supper in the evening, which might throw him off feed for breakfast the next morning. Oatmeal was a part of breakfast, and Church would tell his boys, eat some of the same things your horses do, and you'll get along better with them. Tom and Bill always ate oatmeal for breakfast. I suppose the most important thing I learned from Tom was how to look at a job, situations and circumstances to try to make the very most of what we have to work with. One time, Tom was helping a boy with a sorrel gelding, and I was there watching all that was going on. The boy pulled his saddle off the horse, and Tom and I were far enough away I was pretty sure the boy couldn't hear me, so I asked Tom, what do you think of how hog-backed that horse is? Tom said, I think we can help that horse and fellow, but we're not going to change how that horse's back is built. One time, Tom was staying here a few days late in the fall. My mother and Dad had got some place from their home down by Likey, and I was tending their dog, Lena. She had right short hair and didn't like the cold. The dogs sleep in the basement of this house, and they come in and go out through an outside door down there. Tom and I were up here by the fire, and I was about ready to go to bed, so I told Tom I had to go downstairs and cover up Lena with a blanket before I went to bed. He asked me more about it, and then he said he wanted to go along and watch. So we went down the old steep stairs. I got Lena's blanket and covered her up, tucked the blanket in around her. Tom said, she seems to be thanking you for doing that. The next morning before breakfast, Tom said, I want to go down and see if Lena is still covered up. He came back up and said she was still partly covered. She doesn't have any idea she could do that for herself. Then he said, if I was going to stay here longer, I believe I'd make a project of helping that old dog cover herself with the blanket. I asked him how he would do that. He said, I'm not sure. I've thought about it some. I might take that blanket out in the yard and drag it around and try and get her to join in and take a hold of it and drag it. Just get her to take a hold of it with her teeth would be pretty good. Then later, I might build a low shelf around her bed. The blanket could be laid up on it and help her learn to pull it off on top of herself. Tom liked my flock of chickens. I told him how my dad turned them over to me January 10th, 1959, when the old fellow left that had taken care of them. We have to shut the chickens up at night here so the coons and skunks don't get them. Tom went out with me one morning when I went to open the trap door and turn them loose to range over the ranch. They come out just a-boiling, 4 or 5 abreast, and they cover that country pretty fast. Tom watched a while and he said, they sure are ambitious, industrious birds. Then he said, we were talking the other day about the best ways to count cattle through a gate. I said, yes. Then he said, if you would count these chickens out each morning, you would likely get a plumb hand at counting cows through a gate. I state these examples to help folks see how an exploring, inquisitive mind has no limits for coming up with good ways to get things done. The old saying that no one is free to try a thing unless he can think of it is where Tom was so far ahead of anyone else I ever knew. And what he would think of was so sensible and workable. I've heard Tom tell me and others, develop an awareness. Know what's going on every direction around you. The degree by which he was able to carry this out was a continual learning process for me, and that was helped eminently in the running of this ranch. In the case of sensible, productive work, just about any combination was acceptable to Tom if it worked well for the cattle, horses, and people. In fact, it was so seldom he said, don't do this, don't do that, or this, that when he did, it really got my attention. I will cite the examples of that which I can think of. One time, Tom and I were bringing a few cows to the corrals. He was riding Orville, a roan court I'd started earlier, and I was riding Clyde. Tom said, it's very possible before we get these cattle corralled that one or all may decide to turn back and might keep us pretty busy. We'll do what we can to keep them headed right. But if we do need to turn them and try to head one off, it's important for your horse and for the cows that you keep things set up so the cow does not run across in front of your horse. If you make an attempt to turn her and it doesn't work, turn and go with her. Fall in behind her and take her on a circle till she begins to think about going in another direction. But don't let her run across in front of your horse. Later, Tom told me about how he got that line of thinking. He had a friend, Cliff Wade, up there at Wallowa County, who was 20 years older than Tom, being born in 1890. Tom said Cliff got along real good handling horses and cattle, and he noticed early that Cliff never allowed a cow to turn across in front of his horse in a failed attempt to head the cow off. Another thing that Tom's advice helped me with ever so much in handling cattle was, he told me, if you're going to move one cow or herd of cattle, and if there's one rider or 10 to move them, when you pick up the cow to start her to move, she's going to wander first. which way does this rider want me to go? If the rider waits too long, then the cow will make the decision which way to go, and it may not be the direction the rider wants her to go. Then, by being late to help her move off the desired direction, the rider has caused an unnecessary conflict right off early. It's a fine line, said he, because when you first pick up a cow, she needs a little time to size up horse and rider. Let her have that, but don't wait too long that she makes the decision you don't want her to make. Tom said, when you leave a wire gate open for any longer than just to drive through it and then close it, lay it back against the fence. I've known of 2 or 3 fellows to get broken bones from a gate being opened and thrown down on the ground, and I was one of them. Tom then proceeded to tell me about a wire netting gate that had been thrown down so long the grass and weeds had grown up through it. He was riding a borrowed horse to help some people move a bunch of cattle. In keeping the cows going, he got his horse in that down gate and the horse was shod. He got his feet stuck in the wire and fell over sideways and broke Tom's left leg. One time, I was riding a nervous horse named Luther. I rode into a stackyard where 2 fellows were loading hay. They'd opened the gate and thrown it down. As I rode through the gate, Luther spooked and ran through that down gate, but we were very fortunate he didn't get tangled up and fall. It made me think of Tom's warning about a gate left laying on the ground. I lecture all the crew about it, but none deem it as important as I do. The old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is so true. Tom and I visited a lot about his work, doing clinics, also helping people one-on-one with horses. He told me, if I find out someone seeking help is tired or in a hurry, I lose interest in helping them right quick. And if they're both tired and in a hurry, I find some business elsewhere that must be tended right away. I've heard Tom tell people, be quick, but don't be in a hurry. One time, I was leading a draft mare out to turn her loose in the lot. Tom could see she was anxious to be with her friends. I had only a lead rope around her neck, and it would be easy for her to pull away from me. Tom said, when you lead her out that gate, you take the slack out of the lead rope before she takes the slack out of it. And I did, and even then had nothing to spare. If he would have told me that, she would have pulled away from me and run off with the lead rope, and we would have had to gather her up and get the rope off of her. Once I wanted a short bunch of horses in a fence corner. We were holding them loose there with a few riders. There were about 6 horses I wanted to sort off and put out a gate. Discussing my plans earlier with Tom, I asked enough questions so he had a pretty good picture of the lay of the land, fences and all. Answering his questions was an education in itself. He concluded by saying, it could work, but a lot of things will have to be done just right. The horses that you don't want to go out that gate, you better be pretty sure their tails are towards the gate when you put one of the horses out of the gate that you do want to go out of it. That's helped me a lot of times with horses and cattle both. There's been a lot of time we've held a bunch of cattle to sort some out. There will always be a few that want out of that bunch that we want to hold. I tell the boys holding them, handle that cow so her tail is pointing to the outside of the bunch. There's been a lot of times I've been told it isn't easy to keep her so her tail is to the outside. I say pay close attention before she gets to turn plumb around, do what it takes to turn her back, and then you're not liable to lose her. Tom told me and others many times, when you go to do something, do what it takes to be effective. Don't do more than what it takes and don't do less. Just figure out what it takes to get the results you need. Once, Tom told me his mother and dad both seemed to have that balance figured out real good. Minnie, Tom's mother, was a real good housekeeper and liked things clean and neat. One time, Tom's older brother, Bill, was out with Church, their father, when he was about 5 years old and fell in the creek and managed to waller around in the mud getting out. Church knew Minnie wasn't going to like seeing such a muddy kid. So Church took a piece of paper out of his pocket and wrote on it with a pencil he carried, "Dear Minnie, this is our son Bill. Please take him in. W.C. Dorrance." He told Bill to go to the house and to hand the paper to his mother right away, as quick as you see her. Bill later said that he was so curious what the paper said, as he was too little to read, but he had done as he was told. He said Minnie's first look was of shock and disgust. He handed her the paper, she read it and laughed so much and almost hugged him. Tom told me about a fellow called Art that worked for the Dorrances in Wallowa County. Church and Minnie had moved into Joseph. Tom and Art were staying out at the ranch on Crow Creek. Tom said Art told him, "My biscuits are not as good as yours, and I'd like to know why." So Tom told him, "Well, tomorrow noon, when we come in to cook dinner, I'll watch what you do making them and see what I can see." In those days, the meals were called breakfast, dinner at noon, and supper in the evening. And a lunch was a sandwich or two that was packed out on a job if one couldn't get back to the house for dinner. Tom said, as he watched Art make the biscuits, the ingredients all seemed about right, but he noticed Art stirred the biscuit dough way more than what was necessary. He mentioned that to Art. Tom said later he was thinking about the results Art had handling horses and cattle, and he could see the pattern. In wanting to do a good job, he overdid handling the horses, and he overdid things, and thus didn't have as good a result as if he'd left off a little sooner. I asked Tom if he told Art that, and he said, "No, it's real easy to tell people too much, and they can't bear it too good." Tom worked for a bank headquarters in the Dalles, Oregon in 1949 and 50 for a period of about 1 year. He did appraisal work mostly for cattle and ranches. He said during that time he saw a few people go into the ranching business that hadn't been raised with it and knew very little about it. He continued that seeing them trying to make a go of it, ranching, was like seeing someone trying to flank calves and change ropes at a branding that had never done it before. The calf was liable to wind up on top of him, and the green people trying to ranch might soon find that they were liable to wind up on top. They were on the drown side of business, He said as he worked with the bank job, he saw a lot of people spend an amount of interest that would have in itself have been a very nice income. A number of times he saw people fail and go into bankruptcy, and he said usually one of the last things they would do just before they got foreclosed on was to go buy a new car. I'd heard Tom say failing to prepare is preparing to fail. Tom had a nephew he wanted to see have the best, and Tom told him, when you need to talk about someone, pretend like that person is in the next room and can hear everything you're saying. Tom told me about a joke he heard one time. He said even though there were considerable many cuss words in it, the joke carried a good message. So says he, I went to work on it to clean up the language and keep the meaning. I'd work with it and replace a cuss word or two with better words that were expressive. After some time, I had all the swear words eliminated and replaced with words that could be used in a Sunday school class. I even had the idea that by cleaning up the joke, it had more good meaning than before. As I recall, Tom told me that after I mentioned one time that I noticed he didn't cuss and swear, he said he figured out there was a better way to talk than to use profanity. One time at a clinic, a lady asked Tom, "How much should a person pull on the reins of a horse?" Tom's answer was, "There are times when an amount so slight that it can't be measured is too much. And there are other times when all you've got isn't enough. But generally, it's somewhere in between those extremes." I recall one time Tom was here at the ranch for a few days and we were starting some colts. A fellow had brought a horse up from the home ranch by likely to work with. He was a very good hand with horses and had worked with Tom before. The fellow was saddling a colt and he asked Tom, "When you saddle those colts for the first time, how tight do you like to cinch them up?" "I like to cinch them up right snug so they know they're cinched." Thus, he asked and answered the question. Tom's reply was, "Well, if that's how you like to do it, I guess that's how you ought to do it." I knew Tom liked to ease the cinch into him, so later that evening when the work was done and Tom and I had time to visit, I said, "You made me think of old Benjamin Franklin, the way you answered that fellow about cinching up the colt." Tom looked at me searchingly. So I then quoted Franklin, "If you wish to gain knowledge and improvement from others, but at the same time state yourself as firmly fixed in your present opinions, wise and sensible men who do not like disputation will probably leave you undisturbed and the possession of your errors." Excuse me. Tom asked if I had that in Franklin's writings. I said, yes, it's in his autobiography. So I went and got a copy of it and found the place and gave it to Tom. Each day after that, if Tom was not busy, he was reading Franklin's autobiography. After he was pretty well through, I said, "Well, how about it? You and old Franklin are like two peas in a pod." Tom laid down the book and looked at me and said, "One big difference between me and Benjamin Franklin is that he did way more writing than I have ever done." One of Tom's questions I use often if someone tells me that for no reason their horse bucked, I ask, "What happened just before what happened?" Tom used to encourage us to develop an awareness, know what's going on in the next corral and off to the north and out to the south. A big part of my survival in the ranching business depends on me doing that. Observe, remember, and compare, Tom used to say, and that was a good tool for learning. Tom Dorrance had a fantastic memory. For a time, he and I worked on information for me to write his biography. I have pages and pages of notes. I recall once we got started talking about his dad's cattle and horses. When Church first went to Wallowa County in 1882, he had Durham cattle, now called Shorthorns. They're an old English breed like Herefords and Angus cattle. If Durham cattle are left to produce with no culling for colour, they will produce one red, 2 roans and 1 white. Don't change anything and again you'll get 1 red, 2 roans and 1 white. But for years they've been culled with a preference for the solid red cattle. Church borrowed $500,000 in $500, sorry, the .00 is the cents. $500 in 1882 to buy a team of horses and to get started in the ranching business. He bought land and expanded the operation and bought and sold and raised cattle. He managed the debt, I think, Tom told me, the most the debt was ever up to, but I don't recall the sum just now. But in 1942, the cattle market was strong and Church paid his debt off to zero, and afterwards operated on his own money. I asked Tom if he ever borrowed any money. He said, "Nope, I never did. I saw Dad wrestle with that debt all those years till he was 80 years old, and I didn't want to do that." Tom told me about the first Hereford bull Church bought in 1906, the year Bill was born. He just remembered that bull as he lasted till 1915 when Tom was 5. Then Tom proceeded to tell me about each bull that was bought and about his strengths and drawbacks, about the outstanding cows and their families, clear through to the dispersion of the herd in October 1945. I took the information down in notes, as Tom told me, and I said, "I bet if all those cattle were resurrected and were out here in a field, you'd know them, Tom." Tom paused and said, "They would still be the same cows." I suppose I would. We went through the Dorrance's horses the same way, and I got to hear about the herd from 1882 to 1956, when the last of the ranches were sold. It was so interesting to me. That in-depth attention has helped me appreciate the livestock we have. My best old stud horse, Presley, born in 1986, and is still here and has great-great-grandsons working. The first time Tom saw Presley, he said he looks like old Peter McHugh, a foundation quarter horse stud that was around in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Presley is Morgan, Percheron and thoroughbred. I asked Tom how he would run this ranch if he was me, and what he would do if he got too old and lazy to run it anymore. He would never give me much of an answer other than to say, "I'd do it about like you are." But in our last visit, he brought the question up and said, "I've given it a whole lot of thought. The best I can say is for you to keep running it like you are until you think you can't do it any longer, and then do it for 2 more years. If after those 2 years you're sure you no longer can run the place, sell it, move away, and don't look back, other than to your good memories of your life there. Ranchers are always disappointed if they go back to a place they sold and observe new management." I sure do appreciate Margaret and Tom's friendship and help for all those years. So, look, it got dark outside during that. Thank you for joining me today. Keep tuning into the light, and I look forward to see you next time.